All right. Well, it's 10 a.m. here, uh, out here on the West Coast. So I am going to kick things off. Thanks everyone for joining today. Our webinar topic is going to be Build a Winning SDK Program in 2024. I'm Sid Maestri, VP Developer Relations at APIMatic. And previously, I've built SDK programs at the cloud accounting platform Xero, as well as the API first direct mail API lob. So I've got a little bit of a firsthand experience with this, and I've been with APIMatic for the last year. So let's get into it. And I'll start by just asking, how's everybody doing? 2023 has been a little rough, especially in the tech industry. And I definitely feel that a theme has emerged that we're all being asked to do more with less, and find ways to actually drive returns on our investments around our API programs. And I really feel that 2024 is going to be much better. I'm very optimistic, and I think that an SDK program is part of your strategy for having those returns around your API program, because they help drive higher API adoption. So let's see here. Yep. So let's get in. Before we get into things, though, I do want to touch on the benefits of SDKs, because I know not everyone is sold on the idea. It is a big investment, and so I just want to touch on those. I think Stripe does a really nice job directly in their docs to call out the reduction in boilerplate code that developers have to write is one of the big advantages. But I believe there's lots of other advantages as well. Some of those reasons: if you're writing less code, well, you're having less code that you need to maintain. Also, if you have a developer community, when your API changes or there are security fixes, you can actually deliver those through package managers to all your developers. Importantly, if you have some complexity in your API, being able to put a simplified interface on it is very helpful. And developers like to work in their IDEs. They like to have a code-centric workflow, and good SDKs help you accomplish that with code hinting, autocomplete, inline documentation, all of those lovely benefits. And for you, one of the big benefits is that you get to stay competitive with other API providers and win the love of your developer community. But if those reasons aren't enough for you, and you're still wondering, is it time? Am I ready for SDKs? Then you might want to check out this talk I did in October at Nordic APIs. The title of the talk was "You Don't Need SDKs. Wait, maybe you do." And I talk about signals that you can look for to indicate whether you do or maybe don't need SDKs to support your API program. So there's the URL right there. You should check that out. And maybe someone from my team can post that URL in the comments for people. So what is winning? That's a pretty subjective term. But from my experience, I believe that code generation is foundational to winning when you're building an SDK program. If you can take advantage of code generation, it's 2024 almost. You absolutely should, because there are so many benefits. And so this talk, we're going to look at the 5 steps to create that fully automated SDK program. And those 5 steps that we're going to cover today include keeping your API definition flawless. I know that's aspirational, but we'll talk about that. We'll talk about generating code without compromising the quality. Something that is on everyone's mind right now is onboarding developers. with AI, doing something with AI around the developer experience. So I'll give a sneak peek of what APImatic's doing. Being able to measure what matters around an SDK program. And lastly, automate as many things as you can, because as I mentioned, we're all being asked to do more with less, and automation is one of those keys to scaling a program with limited resources. So I talked about code generation being foundational, and everyone has their reasons, but these are my reasons based on my experience. The first one is really important. Your OpenAPI definition becomes a source of truth. And what that means for you is when you find a bug in your API definition or you make an enhancement to your API, you can roll out updates into multiple SDKs simultaneously. And I don't mean just updating code libraries, but also you can simultaneously update documentation, code samples, all the things around your SDKs. You can make your SDKs part of your overall CI/CD pipeline. And from what I've observed, your updates will be more accurate and will take a lot less time to implement, which in the end frees up some of those engineering resources to build new features as opposed to SDKs. Now, for this webinar, I've used tools like OpenAPI Generator in the past, and there's been several new companies coming into this space offering commercial solutions. And APImatic's been around for over 7 years doing this. And I thought, we should really do a head-to-head comparison for this webinar, because if you're going to start an SDK program today, you've got a lot of choices, and it might be a bit overwhelming to understand what the landscape looks like today versus 5 years ago. So to do my comparison, because I'm a hands-on kind of guy, I took 3 API definitions. The pet store, everyone knows the basic pet store, but then I wanted something a little more advanced, so I took the extended version of the pet store. But if I'm being honest, I find those pet store API definitions a little bit like of fantasy, right? They're just so perfectly crafted and simple. So I went and took the LOB API definition, which I'm familiar with because I worked there, but I also know it has a lot of complexity. It's got a lot of one-ofs and all-ofs and any-ofs, which is around polymorphism and inheritance. And I thought, let's put the different tools to the test using a real API definition. And what I was interested in evaluating as far as the 5 criteria was, what kind of validation and linting does it provide when I submit my API definition into the tool? Does it generate code successfully? I'm a Java guy, and I like strongly typed languages for testing code generators because they really have this compilation stage to tell you if your code is actually runnable. So I wanted to test, do they compile? But beyond compiling, what is the actual experience of pulling that SDK into my IDE and making an actual API call against a live API? So I do a test drive, and then all the documentation that comes with your code generator, because it should generate some documentation. And so I do a comparison there as well. So before we get into the actual code generator, though, let's talk about keeping our API definition flawless. Now, flawless is a little bit of hyperbole, I will admit, because what is flawless? I think really the way to think about our API definitions is, what is the context we're going to use them in, right? Because API definitions are used for designing APIs, mocking APIs, contract testing. So they serve a lot of purposes, and using API definitions to generate docs is very different than generating code. There's a whole set of rules around generating quality, compilable code that is a higher standard and a different bar that you have to reach than those other use cases. So I decided to take a look at the tools and see what happens when I submitted these different API definitions. So with the pet store, both basic and extended, as expected, I got 0 warnings back from 2 out of the 3 tools. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, I had a slide back there with LibLab, which is one of the tools out there. I did actually apply to get access to their early beta, their pre-release, and they didn't get back to me, so I couldn't include them in my comparison. So I'm sorry, we're only comparing 3 tools today. But back to our validation and linting. Interestingly, Speakeasy gave back several warnings talking about orphaned schema components, and or perhaps they were unused, which I thought was a little strange. And so I actually dug into it, and it turned out it was a false warning. There wasn't a problem there. So I think a lot of those warnings around the pet store API are around that. But then I put lob into these tools for linting and validation, and we do see several warnings for the 3 tools. But I do want to mention a warning is not an error. These all come back and say, all the tools come back and say, yes, this is syntactically valid. This is an OpenAPI definition that meets the standards. And what all of these warnings are about is what about these API definitions could be a problem for the tools that are using them. Now you'll notice this 4th column. Because validation and linting is so important, we believe at APIMatic, we actually released a VSCode extension, and that extension actually goes really deep. It's got 1,200 rules that are set up for specifically code generators. And so if you want to go ahead and download that into VSCode, that URL on the screen will take you there. And it's going to really help you get closer to flawless or get to that level of polish that you need. It's really a great tool, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So what does the validation results look like? This is OpenAPI Generator. It's a CLI tool, and when I passed in Lob's API, I got all this information back, but as well as info, I got a lot of warnings back. And the real problem with this kind of validation is that it doesn't tell me where the error is happening. It doesn't give me any insights into the validation rule that I violated or why the generator doesn't like it. And in fact, some of the warnings just generally call out that there might be problems supporting certain areas. Some things it just tells you, I'm just going to ignore this. For example, it didn't like some of the sample example data that was attached to different models. So it just said, that doesn't meet our criteria, we're going to ignore it. So that's pretty common with code generators. But what if I don't want to get warnings and I want to correct them? Well, it doesn't really help you there. Similarly with Speakeasy, I get a lot of warnings, but they do a little better job. They actually tell me what line item the error is at, but it's showing me errors like this one that says is potentially unused or has been orphaned. And when I go and look at it, it's not been orphaned. It is being used. It's just kind of a false positive. Also, a lot of the validation that Speakeasy throws out is around things that it doesn't currently support or things that it's going to find problematic about your API definition, and sort of puts it back on you to figure out, well, am I actually going to change my API for this tool, or do I have to tweak my definition in some unusual way? So that was not a great outcome as far as validation. And when I look at APIMatics, we call out what the validation rule is that's having a problem, but then we actually give you a link to view more details. So we're basically saying there's some invalid sample value here, and we're going to remove it for you. But if you wanted to go and correct that, you click over to the documentation, and it tells you how you can fix that in your API definition. But as you can see, all of these tools, getting a big page full of errors and things like that and validation warnings, it's hard to address. And so, as I mentioned, with that VS Code extension, we have created a tool that will go and find what we would call a silent issue. Now, what's a silent issue? If you're doing an inline schema, then that's not going to generate great code, but it is valid. It does meet the standards for OpenAPI, but the generator tools don't know what to do with inline schemas, and it will make up really odd names, and you'll end up with classes with really odd names that are not intuitive for developers. So we will actually go and automatically fix those for you in this VS Code extension, as well as generate a full PDF report that you can go through and identify all the different line items where things are problematic and go in and fix those. So with LOBS, it found a whole lot of things that you could do to polish it. So to get flawless, I think you need to find those tools that will help you do the linting. You can go and write your own rules. You can use things like Spectral, but I would say check out the VS Code extension as a great way to do that. Number two, we need to generate quality code, generate code without compromising the quality. So that's step number two for our winning program. So I took the three tools, I put our API definitions through them, and I was able to successfully generate code for all three. I do have a couple footnotes, though, for Speakeasy. The first one was that I had to go and remove the headers from different operations inside the pet store example because it wouldn't successfully generate code, it would fail. And I want to keep the comparison going, so I did that. With Lob, it actually called out a lot of warnings when I generated code about how it doesn't support one-ofs or any-ofs. It also has issues with some enums. So those warnings are there, but I'm not here to polish Lob's API spec. I'm here to do a head-to-head comparison. So I soldiered on and I kept going. And what I found was at the code compilation stage, I wasn't able to compile the code that I generated for the Lob API when I used it with OpenAPI generator. It had like 100 plus errors. And with Speakeasy, I had 34 errors. But by removing any references to headers, that was just me taking a wild guess. Maybe I can solve this by removing all the headers, even referenced ones for Lob. That actually allowed me to generate code that I could compile. So again, I want to keep the head-to-head comparison going. So I made that change, but I do caution, you probably don't want to be removing things out of your API definition that could help developers. Like if you're returning headers with rate limit information, you're going to want that inside your SDKs as well. So that's definitely a shortcoming there. But I know you might be saying, wait a second, Sid, how do we trust you? You worked at Lob, you're stacking the deck in favor of APIMatic. So over the weekend, I asked the team at APIMatic to run 10 API definitions through the three different tools and see, could we generate code and could we compile the code? And for languages that don't compile, can we apply some linting to see, does it create compilable code? And these were the results that we got back. There was a lot of issues with OpenAPI generator as well as Speakeasy when it came to running the 6 most popular languages through the paces with these 10 different API definitions. And the languages that are listed there are the languages that had problems. So some languages passed, but some languages couldn't compile or couldn't be generated. So this is a bit more validation that I'm not trying to stack the deck, but I thought I'd share this slide with y'all. So I think the rubber really hits the road when you take a look at what is the code that is implemented in an SDK and how is a developer actually going to experience it. So I know from experience when I was at Lob, the one of any ofs is challenging because for Lob's API, they have a concept of an address, but that address can be a US address or it can be an international address. So it's one of those things. And so the way that APIMatic handles it is that they're on a list object. You get a list of addresses. You get that first object, that first address in the list, and there's a match function. And that match function allows you to check the different cases. Is this a US or is this international? And depending on that, it would then give you back a model, a schema that actually matches that particular type of address. So all those getters and setters that Java developers would expect are available. So a US address, I can get the address line, I can get the state, I can get the zip. What happens if you don't support one-ofs very well? Well, in the case of Speakeasy, first off, I took their code sample and I popped it into my IDE and I tried to just get all the addresses, just get the list back. And it had all these default parameters listed. And when I tried to make the first API call, I got a 422 back. So I decided, why don't I just remove all these? They're optional, and I just remove them as parameters. And then I was able to get a list of addresses back. But then once I got the addresses back, I had to figure out that I had to use an object mapper. I had to import another dependency. I had to use this JS node and actually kind of make it into a tree that I could go and navigate down. And I had to know what was the name of the actual property. So I had to dump the object and figure out it was address underscore line one. So definitely not idiomatic. This is not the way Java developers want to access values from an object. A generic Java object is not what they're looking for. They want a strongly typed object to have getters and setters and all the things that they would expect. But code generation, generating the libraries is just one part of an SDK program. There's also documentation, and we want to generate docs as much as possible. So I did a comparison there. And with APIMatic, for a getting started guide, this I found really interesting when I joined the company. When you first generate your portal with your getting started and your SDK, you can only get the SDK as a zip file because you haven't deployed it to Maven or to NPM or wherever you want to deploy it. So the getting started on the left is what you get, and it walks you through how to not just build your SDK, but then how to import it into Eclipse and use it with a sample project. And it takes you step by step to make that first API call. So when you're in the evaluation stage, it's really nice to have that step-by-step guide. But when you do deploy it to Maven, then the Getting Started guide actually dynamically updates for you when you regenerate your portal, and you get a different set of instructions telling you how to install the package. And then, of course, I mentioned this developer portal. You actually get a full developer portal that includes that same getting started information, and it dynamically changes based on how you're deploying or how developers are actually going and installing your SDK. So this is all really nice. What about the other tools that are out there? Well, OpenAPI Generator does, it covers the basics, tells you how to do a clean install to install your SDK locally in Maven, and then how you might deploy it with a link off to a guide to go figure out how do you actually configure your machine to deploy to Maven, which I've done, and that's a challenge, but with a little hard work you can get there. And then also has a full example there that that you would copy and paste. But I'm going to talk about code samples in a minute. So it's got the basics. Speakeasy, similarly, one difference is that they have more of a approach around Gradle as opposed to Maven. I don't know. I personally am a Maven user, so I had to kind of figure out like how do I do this with Gradle. I eventually got it to work, but pretty basic instructions here for getting started. I feel like there's some gaps in here, like to get the user from getting the package to like actually installing it and using it in my project. So I would definitely rate these as good coverage versus partial coverage when it comes to getting started. All the tools generate Java docs, which is great to see. So I was happy to see that happen. And then I took a look at the SDK reference docs. And as I mentioned, APIMatic has a portal. On the left side, you've got all your endpoints, your models, your exceptions, and you can navigate and get an example of what the JSON looks like. And here we have a list of pet objects that we want to actually get from our list pets method. OpenAPI generator does, again, pretty good job. It tells me what parameters I need to pass, as well as my return type, a list of pet objects, and what headers, etc. Speakeasy goes really, really minimal on this, and this is all these are markdown files. It's not like a portal that they're generating for you. Interestingly, their response is a list pets response. So I'm not sure how I go and pull out my pet objects with that. I'd have to click through and probably read that documentation as well. So again, varied results across the different tools around documentation. And for me, this would be my summary when it came to running Lob's API definition through. Things didn't really compile without me drastically removing things from the definition to get it to run with some of the tools. So this would be my summary, but we're not done with our comparison, because for me, the self-serve capability of an SDK program is really important, because if your API team is having to field a lot of questions, your support team is overwhelmed, then SDKs, for it to be a winning program, really has to enable a lot of self-service for developers. And for me, self-service is code-centric, at least in multiple languages. That's the way I view it. So I took a look at the code samples that the different tools provide. And for APIMatic, you select a language, you get documentation that you can interact with. So if I change the name of my pet, it would actually change the code on the right dynamically. And if I go ahead and expand it and click the configure button, I can toggle between a condensed example and a fully runnable example, which I think is the holy grail, because without this dynamic capability, you're sort of left choosing, do I want to give my developers a static full example or a static condensed example? One's fully runnable and harder to read. One is more specific to the endpoint. APIMatic's portal also has a nice try it out button where you can actually make live API calls after you put in your access token. So it's kind of nice that way too. OpenAPI generator, when it comes to generating code samples, sadly falls short in the regard that it's not a runnable code sample. I am creating a new pet and I didn't set any values on it. So if I tried to run this, I would get an error back from the API because it's missing required values. Speakeasy, I was happy to see that they include those default values. So this code, once you add an auth token, will be runnable. So self-serve, when it comes to code samples, this is how the different tools stack up. But if you want to really, I'm going to keep like ratcheting it up here. If you really want your SDK program to be winning, then you got to think about use cases. Companies like Stripe are already doing this. How do we not just tell you about each endpoint, but how do we explain how to solve your business problem and give you the series of code samples that you can put together to create a whole solution. And so Stripe does this by letting you choose a front end and a back end, and actually updating their code in this tutorial so you can build a custom payment flow, which I think is pretty cool. Similarly, APIMatic now offers guided walkthroughs, and this is Verizon's portal. We've allowed their ability to chain together a series of API calls to achieve a specific business goal and solve for a use case. And you can try out the API call in the docs and then go to step 2, and it will take the response from the first call and feed it into the second call. And you can build these as many steps as you need to solve your business case. And I'll say from personal experience, I've created these by hand when I was at Lob. There were about 8 or 10 use cases that our customers were always asking about. And so I created these in multiple languages, and it was a lot of work. And ultimately, when I left Lob, one of my concerns was who's going to keep these up to date and maintain these? If the API changes or something changes around the requirements, who's going to go back and update all these use case guides? And so maintenance is a problem. This example for Verizon is actually generated, so it reflects the latest API. So that's our guided walkthroughs. And lastly, I want to talk about starter apps and videos. I've done this myself. The tools available don't generate these things, but if you're creating a really strong SDK program, creating a starter app, creating YouTube videos that demonstrate how to actually use your starter app, I think is a really powerful way to help developers and kind of help with that onboarding and getting them, to production as quickly as possible by giving them fully runnable examples. And so that's something that I'm in favor of. So now API onboarding magic. So I'm hoping that this is going to work. I may have to do a little tab switching here. Give me a second here. Oh, great. Cool. So I can share this tab now. So what we've done at APIMatic is we're working on AI and how can it make the developer experience better. And so this is a proof of concept. It's got a little DevX assistant here, and we've got some predefined prompts. But when this goes to production, a developer could ask the AI any question. And what's special about this is it's not just going out to ChatGPT and writing whatever kind of code it wants and, hopefully not hallucinating, but what we want to do is we want it to use the SDKs that we've generated that we know are production ready, and we want it to use the code samples that we've generated for Verizon. And so that's what we did. We've trained the models, and we've got a layer of business logic that we've added in there to ensure that it's going to always create consistent, high-quality code based around our SDKs. So I'm going to paste my question in there, and I'll expand the window. And my AI bot starts writing code for me that goes beyond those code samples you see on the right side and is a bit more like those guided walkthroughs, but in this case, it's dynamic, and it's based on the developer asking the question what it's trying to accomplish with your APIs. And in addition to this runnable code that gets generated, it actually gives an explanation of what's happening in the code, which I think is really exciting. So I know AI is going to continue to be a hot topic, and we're going to continue to look for ways to incorporate that. And I imagine for a lot of you, if you're building an SDK program and you want to keep pushing forward, AI is probably going to be part of your thinking and your strategy around how to do that. Now I'm going to switch back to my slide deck. And I'm going to talk about measuring what matters in your program. Now, I know we all like to focus on that popular metric, time to first hello world, or time to first API call. And I definitely think you should measure that. But there are other things that you want to know, like which languages are your developers using the most? Which code samples are they copying and pasting and using the most? And so when I look at the tools, APIMatic is the only one that offers any kind of analytics around the portal that we generate. Things like the number of visitors, the number of SDK downloads, which pages are being viewed. We have that try it out, which is sort of like a lightweight postman. How many direct API calls are being made, and also what code is being copied. And it's got sort of an overview with different metrics to show sort of what's the change from month to month, how things are, how your views are going, and your SDK downloads. There's a time to hello world metric here that we've got. And if you have your API portal visits, we've got different languages here that you can see how those are ranking. And then different, these are the 5 most popular documentation pages. So, create a send message. They're visiting getting started a lot. They're interested in HTTP status codes. So what do these metrics do for you? Well, I think they really can guide you towards what additional content do you need to create? Where are developers' questions coming from? What are they most interested in? Where might they be struggling? And then you can take your resources and deploy them towards creating more educational material and helping developers in a specific language or maybe in a specific topic that they're finding challenging in your developer portal. And lastly, automating everything. This is a really exciting topic because as someone who's gone through the process of building 6 SDKs for a company and having to figure out how to automate things, we didn't always get there. We often had a lot of manual processes that slowed things down. So the most obvious one, though, is SDK publishing. So we've got all these great package managers, and every time you generate a new version of your code libraries, you want to publish those automatically. So again, I looked at the 3 tools. OpenAPI Generator doesn't have anything like that. It's an open source tool that's focused on code generation. But Speakeasy does have it, and I thought, NPM is a really easy package manager to use, so I thought I would go and generate an access token, drop it into Speakeasy, and save and regenerate my SDK to see, what the results were. Unfortunately, it didn't publish successfully to NPM, and on top of that, it didn't really tell me why. There wasn't any feedback in the UI. There weren't any logs I could go access. It didn't send me an email and notify me that I'd failed to publish. So I was sort of left in the dark on that. But with APIMatic's publishing feature, we've got a different approach. We've got a specific publishing profile, so you can create 1 or more publishing profiles. And the first step in that in building that profile is to enter the sort of general information about your package. And then we take that and we pre-populate all the other language packages so that as you step through them, you can accept the defaults or you can modify them to your liking. And it publishes to both GitHub and to the package manager of choice. And we have a way for you to go and add your credentials in here. And really importantly, there's inline documentation that tells you step by step how to go about getting those credentials configured in the different package managers, which can be challenging. Once you've set up your languages, in this case, I've just set up TypeScript because I want to do a head-to-head comparison, and I've got it all configured. I can tell what package version I want to call this, and when I hit publish, after a few minutes, it tells me if it was successful or if it failed. I have done it where it's failed, and those logs were really useful because when I clicked into logs, I realized I had named my package Pet Store. And guess what? There's already a package on NPM called Pet Store. So of course it was going to fail. But it was good that I could figure that out on my own and change the name of my package and successfully publish. So this is sort of the results from my comparison. OpenAPI generator doesn't have any capability there, and with Speakeasy, we could only publish to their GitHub repo. So those are the results. And then the last piece of automation that I want to talk about is docs as code. This is super important, I think, because a lot of companies want to bring together technical writers as well as engineers. And GitHub's the perfect place because you've got version control, the ability to review pull requests. And so you can put all your markdown files, your images and screenshots, as well as your API definition into GitHub. And when anything is changed and committed, it should then kick off some kind of build process. So in a nutshell, that's what docs as code means. APIMatic supports this. These are some of the benefits. As I talked about, collaboration, familiar tools and workflow, smaller feedback loops, all really good things. So APIMatic has a sample repo, a template that you can fork, and you can then add your API definition. I had to try it myself because I always have to prove these things work to myself. And I decided to upload an image. And when I committed it, it did a build. And it's sort of a 3-step process. You've got a build file, API definition, static files. What it does is during the build process, it hits an API from APIMatic, and you have to have your API key set in GitHub to do that. It zips up everything, posts that to APIMatic, and then what it returns is a downloaded zip portal that you unzip and deploy to whatever infrastructure. And in our example, we were using Netlify. So I added my Netlify API access token as well. And I went ahead and ran that GitHub action, went through all the different steps. And in the end, I got a nice, I took the generic portal and I added a nice logo in the upper left corner, and I changed the name of the pet store to Sid's Super Pet Store. So very basic example, but docs as code support is important. I'm pretty sure that Speakeasy supports this because they do have, push source code to GitHub, but I'm not sure if they have a whole, way to do this automatically through GitHub Actions, but APIMatic definitely does. OpenAPI generator definitely could support this, but you got to roll everything from hand, so you'd be writing that for yourself and figuring out how to do it on your own. So this is the summary for our webinar today, the 5 steps for your fully automated SDK program, that flawless API definition, generate code without compromise. If you can get some AI magic happening, that's another win. Make sure you can measure what matters, and the ability to automate as many things so you can do more with less. But before I go, I want to mention that building a program is one step in a journey. There's also the ongoing maintenance. So definitely think about this. How will you handle changes in different languages, things being deprecated, new features being added? How do you keep your code idiomatic and up to the expectations of developers, as well as all the different dependencies that will be changing over time? One way that APIMatic is addressing this is, instead of generating everything for your SDK and putting it all in statically inside of your SDKs, we've actually abstracted away all the common functions and methods that your SDK would rely on. And now all you do is generate the things that are unique for your API, and you import this core library, which has a full test suite around it and is maintained by the APIMatic team. So when things change in our core library, we can push those out to the SDKs for you, so you don't have to take on that burden. If you want to go ahead and read a blog post with much more in depth about how we built these, we've got this URL on the screen. It explains our philosophy, but also how we went about moving from the old style to this new style with core libraries. And here's the final slide, or second to final slide, the penultimate. This is the one that summarizes everything we've looked at today in this comparison around tools for building SDKs, linting and validation, code generation. I think looking at what languages are generally available versus in some form of beta is important to know. And what kind of test coverage, does it have any kind of interactive use cases or interactive request builder? All those things can be important to building a winning SDK program. So grab your screenshot right there, and I'll leave you with one last URL for today. I don't have time to go and answer questions live, but if you go to this tiny URL and you go to the form, and you can ask me any question on the content that we shared today, as well as anything about SDKs, OpenAPI, developer experience, building SDK programs, I'm happy to continue the conversation with you. So thanks for joining me. Have an amazing holiday season, and I'm wishing you all the best in 2024.